Donald Trump has recently hinted that if he wins a second term, he intends to use the military against his critics and his enemies. And not only do those hints keep coming, but legal scholars have confirmed that if Trump wins the presidency and decides to abuse its powers, there is very little that Congress or the courts can do to stop him. But before we unpack all that, if you haven't yet, please hit that like, subscribe, and the alert bell. All right, folks, I know, again, some of you are probably sick and tired of the Trump is a fascist videos, but he finds new and creative ways to convey it, and we have to talk about it because the threat of a Trump presidency is very real, and he has a very fascistic agenda. And one of the elements of that is that he intends to use the military to a far greater extent than he did in his first term. And there was reporting during his first term about how he fetishized the military the way that authoritarians often do. As a matter of fact, it was reported that he wanted to do like Soviet era May Day style parades with him overlooking a balcony as the military, paraded through probably 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue and all the things. Openly deranged. But in his first term, there were checks against Trump's derangement. Well, now he's going for broke, and he's made that abundantly clear, as we've discussed in video after video after video. But we have new reporting about the situation with the military in terms of what he intends to do. Now, this comes from the Associated Press. Trump hints at an expanded role for the military within the U.S. A legacy law gives him few guardrails. Now, as a reminder, the fact that he wants to use the military against his critics and his enemies isn't exactly new. It was reported on by the New York Times and other outlets just a couple of weeks ago as part of the ongoing coverage about Project 2025, which is Trump and the Heritage Foundation's, grand scheme to radically reshape the executive branch so he can hoard power unto himself, erode checks and balances, erode civic protections, basically make the president a one-man a branch of government in the most extreme ways. As the New York Times talked about, while in office, Trump mused about using the military to attack drug cartels in Mexico, an idea that would violate international law unless Mexico consented. That idea has taken on broader Republican appeal. Ron DeSantis and others have talked about it as well. And then you have the Posse Comitatus Act, which was signed in 1878 under President Hayes, and it basically forbids the military from being used to enforce domestic policy. It keeps the military separate, right? Donald Trump wants to either go around it or just openly violate it. So by using the Insurrection Act, as the New York Times points out, another law called the Insurrection Act creates an exception. Trump wanted to invoke the Insurrection Act to use troops to crack down on protesters after the 2020 killing of George Floyd. And it was also discussed during Trump's presidency as something that could be used to seize voting machines to try to overturn the results of the election. It was seriously considered by Trump and his inner circle, openly deranged. Now, that Associated Press article goes into more detail because we actually have had legal scholars review the threat. So we're going to get to that. Trump has not spelled out precisely how he might use the military during a second term, although he and his advisors have suggested that they would have wide latitude to call up units. While deploying the military regularly within the country's borders would be a departure from tradition, the former president has already signaled an aggressive agenda if he wins, from mass deportations to travel bans imposed on certain Muslim-majority countries. Again, that was also talked about as part of Project 2025. A law first crafted in the nation's infancy would give Trump, as commander-in-chief, almost unfettered power to do so, military and legal experts said in a series of interviews. The Insurrection Act allows the president to call on reserve or active duty military units to respond to unrest in the states, an authority that is not, I repeat, is not reviewable by courts. I'll say again, this is an authority that is not reviewable by courts. One of its few guardrails merely requires the president to request that the participants disperse. And this is a quote, "The principal constraint on the president's use of the Insurrection Act is basically political, that presidents don't want to be the guy who sent tanks rolling down Main Street," said Joseph Nunn, a national security expert with the Brennan Center for Justice. That's not much really in the law to stay the president's hand. There's not much really in the law to stay the president's hand. Even more alarmingly, a spokesman for Trump's campaign did not respond to multiple requests for comment about what authority Trump might use to pursue his plans. This is absolutely deranged. And this is another part here I want you to hone in on. Congress passed the act in 1792, just 4 years after the Constitution was ratified. As we've talked about as part of political history, you have to remember that the presidency was the branch, it was the position that the founding fathers, to whatever extent you subscribe to their very flawed wisdom, I know a lot of conservatives do, so consider this. The presidency was the one aspect of government about which the founding fathers worried the most because they just fought a war to emancipate themselves from King George III. So they didn't want to create an all-powerful executive. And if you look at Article 2 of the Constitution, which discusses the presidency, it is relatively threadbare. It's relatively bare bones. And much of what we know from the presidency all the way today was fashioned by President Washington, because George Washington was the one figure that the founding fathers essentially trusted to act in good faith, to be so allergic to, despotic urges to seize power, that they gave him some very few guardrails, kind of a skeletal structure, and allowed him to fill it out. And so when they passed the Insurrection Act, the idea was, okay, you would have somebody like George Washington, who was a nonpartisan, at least by today's standards, good faith actor who had already turned down absolute power. When he was the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army after they defeated the British, he surrendered his commission. He turned his sword and his power back over to the Continental Congress. He didn't have to do that. That was unheard of at the time. Can you imagine Napoleon Bonaparte doing something like that? Of course not. But Washington, for all his faults, lived up to the Cincinnatus principle that you give up power. Therefore, they trusted him. Now imagine that sort of insurrectionist act where it's basically like, yeah, just use your best judgment, but otherwise this is not an authority that's reviewable by the courts. Imagine that sort of discretion in the hands of somebody like Donald Trump. Now, that article also mentions that one of the things that Trump wants to do is bring back Michael Flynn. Yeah, Trump has already suggested that he might bring back retired Army Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, who served briefly as Trump's national security advisor and twice pled guilty to lying to the FBI during its Russian influence probe before being pardoned by Trump. Flynn suggested in the aftermath of the 2020 election that Trump could seize voting machines and order the military in some states to help rerun the election. Okay. Now, with that in mind, I want to give you a bit of a refresher as to who Michael Flynn is. This hasn't been updated in a year, but this is 5 minutes of Michael Flynn's craziness, just a compilation. We're not going to go through the whole thing, but brace yourselves because this guy is truly nuts, even by MAGA standards.
We are going to have one nation under God, which we must. We have to have one religion, one nation under God and one religion under God, right?
They're talking about putting the vaccine into salad dressing. Or salads. Have you seen this?
Yes.
Have you seen this? Had I stayed in that position, we would have never had all this foolishness with COVID.
They fear us. They fear this Make America Great Again. They fear those that say America first. They fear God Almighty. Did you know that a governor can declare war? Governor can declare war. Okay? And we're going to probably see that. 90% of the departments of whatever. Just lock them up.
I think I pled the fifth over 180 times that day.
They have an intent to have a new world order. They have an intent to track every single one of us.
I could go on. It goes on for like that. Believe it or not, I know that felt like an hour, but that was only 56 seconds. That's who Donald Trump wants to empower, the likes of Michael Flynn and Michael Flynn specifically, to wield that sort of power against the American people, against his critics and his enemies. Now, you might think, okay, well, that's Michael Flynn. What about people in the military? Because surely there are people in the military who would oppose that. Well, setting aside the chain of command that the president is commander-in-chief, is the single highest individual authority. Of course, the military doesn't pledge allegiance to a president. They serve the Constitution, but who interprets the Constitution? Well, typically it's the president in terms of military orders. So it gets very complicated. But I want to draw your attention to, Mark Milley, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff who served under Trump and President Biden before he retired recently, just a couple of months ago. He was seen by MAGA in hindsight as a check on Trump, as somebody who thwarted Trump's despotic designs. Well, this is what Steve Bannon, a Trump advisor, a Trump supporter, somebody who helped craft the Trump campaign's messaging. This is what he has to say about somebody like Mark Milley, who again was seen as a check on Trump's derangement.
These questions several different times in writing.
Were you giving the Chinese information about thinking of the president of the United States?
Okay, what there was authorized? Well, the commander-in-chief didn't authorize it. We're going to have plenty of time to do that because we're going to hold him accountable. We don't know the form yet of how charges are going to be filed, but this guy's not going to get away with this. It was treasonous.
And Bannon, among others, including Michael Flynn, have actually suggested that Mark Milley should be executed for treason, and Trump has suggested that as well. Folks, this is not a drill. This is absolutely 100% serious. And as we've talked about, there is such a risk, just a reflex of becoming desensitized to it. Oh, it's Donald Trump. Oh, it's not. We can't take that for granted. The United States is not above fascism. Fascism can topple any government because any government relies on reciprocal good faith from the players, from the people who run the institutions. And right now, you have the Republican Party, one of two major political parties, which has become utterly compromised to this man. Those who do know better are too afraid to say something because they'll lose re-election, or worse, those who do know better and have said something are no longer within positions of influence like Mitt Romney, Adam Kinzinger, Liz Cheney, and the rest are either fully indifferent to it or they're bought in. And then you have a landscape, as we've discussed, a media landscape, a political landscape, which heavily advantages that party. And then you have the Democratic Party, which is the infinitely better option in terms of preserving the democratic republic. We've got our own issues. We're also prone to infighting. We're also prone to things which make it difficult for us to check the Republican Party. We have to be firing on all cylinders. We have to be moving in just perfect sync and unity. And we have a hard time doing that. This is a very real possibility. Donald Trump is indeed leading, as of this moment, in the polls against President Biden. Something might change between now and then. Hopefully, God willing, it does. But this is a very real possibility. We have to take it seriously. Donald Trump and his movement are the single greatest political threat to this country, arguably, in its history. Certainly in terms of domestic politics, they are, with the exception possibly of the Civil War. Okay? But that's a very real possibility for our future. And we now know that Donald Trump intends to use the military in some way, shape, or form in ways that he didn't before. And he seems to have his critics and his enemies in his targets. Let me know what you think in the comments.